The Hope Chest, Chapter 5. Hobie and the Brakeman. They would never have gotten to Washington if Hobie the hobo hadn't shown up, shown them how to frisk a head-end blind. He was about Violet's age. She was sure. He wore knee breeches and the same sort of ankle black boots that Myrtle and Violet had, but his face wore a studied expression of world weariness that made him look at least 40. He had a plug of tobacco fixed firmly in his left cheek and talked around in a fluent hobo slang. "You Angelinas looking to catch a blind?" he said, and Violet and Myrtle stood on the platform as Myrtle and Violet stood on the platform in Penn Station, wondering what their chances were of boarding a train without tickets and not being caught. "What?" said Myrtle. "Are you blind baggage?" he said. I don't think so," said Violet firmly, as an attempt to end the conversation. Hobie looked exactly like the wrong sort of people that her mother was always talking about. "Too bad. You should be. If you want to make the miles, hopping the freights is your rubes," said the boy. "Too slow. Even if you get on a 500-miler, who wants to spend all their time on a drag line? And you can get your legs sliced off riding the rods. You gotta ride the blinds. You want to make any miles." Violet moved away, but to her distress, Myrtle was looking at the boy with interest. "Can you get us onto a train?" Myrtle said. "Thought you'd never ask, Angelina. My name's Hobie. Hobie the hobo." He extended his hand. Myrtle shook it. Then he stuck his hand at Violet. She wanted nothing to do with this boy, but she was too polite not to take his hand and shake it. His hand felt rough and calloused. "A lot of the brothers and sisters of the road won't come into the big burg," Hobie said. "Too many bulls in New York. But it ain't hard if you stay away from the freight yards. You know how to catch a blind." "We need to get to Washington," said Myrtle. "Can you show us how?" "Washington," Hobie swept his hair back from his forehead and rocked back on his heels, thinking. "Gonna catch the bums own. Then the Ma and Pa. Those are the railroads," he added. "Gonna change in Philly and Baltimore. Stay off the hot boxes unless you catch a hot shot. Aw, you Angelinas don't know anything about riding the rails, do you?" "No, nothing," said Myrtle. But it soon became clear that Hobie knew everything, at least about hoboing, and he intended to tell them. As he talked, Violet drew Myrtle aside and tried to whisper that they needed to lose Hobie quickly. Myrtle wouldn't even let her start. "He's going to help us," she said, shrugging Violet away. Violet was annoyed. She didn't want to be thought of as a coward. She liked that Myrtle was a person who was willing to take off and do something, like leave her school institute and go up to Washington. It reminded her a little of Flossie, who was always ready to try something new, without a whole lot of discussion or worrying and planning. Violet wondered if she'd changed so much since Flossie's death that she'd become a worrier and a fraidy cat that Flossie wouldn't even like anymore. It was a horrible thought. She listened to what Hobie was telling them. The blind baggage meant riding in the blind spot between the engine and the baggage car of the passenger train. The trick was to duck in just after the highball, the 2 short blasts on the whistle. That meant the train was about to leave. After the conductors had all stepped onto the train. When the blast came, Hobie grabbed them each by a hand and darted onto the steel platform behind the engine, so quickly that Violet caught her foot on the edge and stumbled and almost fell onto the tracks. Hobie grabbed the collar of her midi blouse and pulled her back. "Steady, Angelina," he said. They sat facing backward on account of the cinders, which flew back from the smokestack as the train gained speed and filled the air with the smell of coal smoke. Violet and Myrtle sat huddled together, trying not to look at the ground whizzing by beneath them. The train jolted about as it picked up speed, and there was nothing to hold on to. The platform had no walls. One good jolt, Violet thought, and all 3 of them would fly off into the landscape that was zipping past. Hobie was unperturbed. He leaned back and told them about his adventures. He was 12 years old, he admitted, and he had been riding the rails on and off for 2 years. "Where do you come from?" Myrtle asked. "Tennessee, Cooper Hill, Tennessee, up in the Blue Ridge." "But there ain't hardly nowhere I ain't been," Hobie bragged. "Been all over Hobiehenia." He swept his arm to indicate the scenery they were passing, which they couldn't see very well because they were squinting to keep the cinders out of their eyes. It seemed to go on forever. What if she had just stayed home, Violet thought. What would she be doing right now? It was night. She would have already read to Stephen. Dinner would be over, including the nightly endurance of table manners and impossible rules, like eating everything on your plate, even horrible, grisly, fat pieces of meat. Or, if you'd have to eat it for breakfast tomorrow. She'd be alone in her room, in her bed, under the green chenille bedspread, reading one of her Oz books by the bedside lamp. Instead, she was hunched over on the vibrating iron platform, breathing smoke and nearly deafened by the clatter of wheels on trains, so she could hardly hear Hobie. He seemed to be saying that he didn't need to go to school because he was going to be educated by some hobo college that some rich man was starting. It must be nearly midnight, Violet guessed. When they reached Philadelphia, they walked across numerous tracks to a freight yard. "We can catch a fast freight from here to Baltimore," Hobie said. "But it ain't here yet. I'm going over to the jungle to get some hobo stew." He indicated a clump of trees from which a thin column of smoke was rising. Violet and Myrtle started to follow him, but he held up a hand to stop them. "Nope, you Angelina stay here. This is a bad jungle. Too many of the Johnson family. You know what I mean? Too many profesh." "I guess he means criminals." Violet stopped and looked at Myrtle. "Oh, no. Do I look as bad as you do?" "Probably," said Myrtle, "if I look that bad." "You do," Violet assured her. Myrtle looked as though she had been taking a bath in charcoal. Her dress was no longer blue and white striped, but coal smoke black, and her formerly white mop cap and apron matched. They sat down on the gravel of the roadbed. It was very uncomfortable. Violet wondered if there was anywhere nearby where they could buy something to eat. Anything that wouldn't mind serving people who looked like that they had been swept out of the bottom of a fireplace, and if any place was even open at this hour. "What time do you think it is?" Violet asked. Myrtle shrugged. "Really late. I think it's around 10 at night. I think it was around 10 at night when we left New York." Hobie brought them 2 tin cans full of what he said was stew. Violet was too hungry to be particular. They drank this and ate the stew as best they could with their grimy fingers. It was full of vegetables. Violet didn't recognize the bits of meat. It was best not to examine too closely. But it tasted all right. "We slept here tonight," said Hobie, "but not in the jungle. I didn't tell the Yeggs you were here. Some of them don't know how to act proper around ladies. We'll sleep over there in one of them broke-down cars. There's a through freight to Baltimore tomorrow." So that was what they did. Hobie told them more of his adventures as they fell asleep, under the covering of newspapers, on a wheelless flat car. Violet looked up at the stars and wondered if she would really see Chloe tomorrow. When the newspapers fluttered and rustled in the breeze, she thought about the green chenille bedspread. But she didn't wish she was back in Susquehanna. She was having an adventure, and Myrtle was a good person to have an adventure with, just like Flossie would have been. It was funny, but Violet felt as if there was some part of her that had been locked up since Flossie's death, even more locked up than the rest of her was, and that it was being set free. As for Hobie, she was getting used to him. The main thing was not to look at him directly, so you didn't have to realize he was just a kid. When he kept talking like he was his own grandfather, As Violet drifted off to sleep, Hobie was talking about how he wanted to go to Florida, one of the few places he admitted he hadn't never been. It had been easy for Myrtle to decide to leave the Girls' Training Institute in New York. In her mind, she'd left it the moment she arrived a year ago. When she was 9, Myrtle didn't know where her life was going to take her. But she was ready for it to take her somewhere else, and she didn't intend to be anybody's maid. Myrtle wasn't tough like Hobie, but she wasn't soft like Violet either. Still, she woke up in the morning stiff and achy. The rough wooden floor of the flat car was even less comfortable than the lumpy cots at the Girls' Training Institute, which were said to be left over from the Civil War. She and Violet ate some stale donuts Hobie brought from the jungle and drank bitter chicory coffee from tin cans. Violet made a face over the coffee, and when Myrtle asked if she had ever had chicory coffee before, she admitted she'd never had coffee before at all. Hobie was wrong about one thing. Boxcars were a lot more comfortable than riding the blinds. They rode in the Deadhead, an empty boxcar, on the through freight to Baltimore. When they got to Baltimore, the railroad police, whom Hobie calls bulls, chased them away from the blinds. So they had to take another freight. They were jouncing along in an empty boxcar, sitting on the wooden floor, watching tobacco fields pass by and listening to Hobie talk about the Rocky Mountains, when there was a loud wooden thump, and a white man in a blue coverall landed on the boards in front of them. Myrtle leapt to her feet and backed away from him. His hands were balled into tight fists, and he advanced them menacingly. "Stealing rides, eh? Should I turn you into the bulls or throw you off the train?" Hobie got to his feet and folded his arms. "It's your train, is it?" "It sure ain't yours," said the man. "So what's it going to be? Do I ditch you, or are you ready to throw?" "I don't have any money," said Hobie defiantly, "so ditch me." The man clearly didn't like this idea. "How about one of the Angelinas, then?" He reached out and grabbed Myrtle. He stank of sweat and soot. Myrtle struggled. His hand dug painfully into her arm. He lifted her into the air and grabbed her ankle in the other hand. The floor and the walls lurched crazily past, and Myrtle couldn't catch her breath to scream. He swung her. He was going to throw her out the open door. "You ready to see her hit the grit?" The white man's voice seemed to lurch, too. He swung Myrtle again, and she saw the ground whizzing beneath her, terrifyingly close and fast. "I have money!" Violet screamed. Myrtle saw a flash of grubby pink skin as Violet tried to grab the man's arm. "I have money! Put her down! Right now!" The man set Myrtle down jarringly, as if he hadn't been gripping her arms tight behind her. She would have fallen. "Mix me a hike, then," he ordered. Violet scrabbled in her blouse and drew out a pinned handkerchief. She had started to hand it over to Hobie when Hobie grabbed her arm. "Don't," he said. "Are you crazy?" Violet snapped. 15 cents, Hobie said. "He gets 15 cents. 30, said the criminal, twisting Myrtle's arm in a few inches for emphasis. It hurt horribly. Myrtle felt dizzy with pain. She saw Violet wince with sympathy. 15, said Hobie. "That's the hike." 10 cents per 100 miles, said the criminal. "Each." We ain't going no 100 miles, said Hobie. "We're going to Washington, and that ain't but half that." "Give him 15, Angelina." Myrtle couldn't believe he was arguing about money with this madman. Violet handed the criminal the 3 nickels. He grabbed them and let Myrtle go with a kind of disgusted shove. She fell to the floorboards. "Are you all right, Myrtle?" Myrtle felt Violet's hand on her arms. "Myrtle, say something." Myrtle didn't want to say anything because she thought if she opened her mouth, she might be sick. She wasn't normally a person to get dizzy easily, but then nobody had ever swung her out the open door of a moving train before. When she could see clearly again, the man was gone. Hobie looked at him philosophically. Don't think he's been a brakeman too long, that fella. You'd hardly ever see a brakie who's still got both hands. A brakeman? Violet stared at Hobie. You mean that criminal works for the railroad? Yep, said Hobie, casting a disgusted look out the open door. How did he get in here? Myrtle asked, shakily. Roof, said Hobie, nodding upward. Brakies can climb all over the outside of the moving train. Doesn't bother them none. I would think, said Violet, who Myrtle saw was starting to tremble now, they would fall off. Oh, they do, all the time. Die like flies, said Hobie. They're not all like that, he added fairly. Most of them don't care if the brothers and sisters want to grab an armload of boxcars. Myrtle had gotten used to Hobie's talk enough to figure out that was another way to say, catch a ride. It was evening when they arrived in Washington. When they got off the train in Washington, Hobie stayed on. I think I'm going to ride this as far as it goes, he said. Might make it to Florida. He seemed to have no interest in actually being in any of the places the trains went to, Myrtle thought, but only in getting to them. Myrtle had met kids like Hobie before. New York was full of them. Grown-up kids who had been out on their own for years. She didn't really blame Hobie for being tough enough to argue with a brakeman who was threatening to throw her out of a train. Toughness was what kept such kids alive. But the big thing, she said, shocked her. But the next thing he said shocked her. They are bound to be a lot of brakemen between Washington and Florida, Violet said. She reached for her pinned-up handkerchief of money and tried to give it to Hobie. He wouldn't take it. I have money, he said. You what? Myrtle squawked. You have money? You were going to let that brakeman throw Myrtle out of the train when you had money to pay him with? Violet demanded. No, of course I wasn't, said Hobie. He did not elaborate. You Angelinas, take care now. Myrtle didn't know whether to believe him or not about the money, and about whether he would have let the brakeman throw her off the train. She decided she had to believe he wouldn't have. The alternative was too awful. She took a deep breath. You take care too, Hobie, she said. Yes, and thank you, said Violet. They waved to him as the train pulled out.